The car doors of the big sedan slammed shut as the two men sprinted into the nearby diner to get out of the steady drizzle that was falling from the sky. It was a typical spring day in the big city, with folks shuffling to and fro on their way to whatever concerns gave meaning to their lives. They had chosen the diner across from the seedy motel for their lookout rather than sitting in their car, both because it offered a better vantage point and because it served a decent cup of coffee. Lenny Lucchesi slid into the battered old booth by the front window, ignoring the duct tape that covered a large hole in the upholstery. His nephew, Marco, took a seat across from him, picking up a menu that was pinned between the condiments and the napkin holder. "We don't have time to eat, kid," said Lenny. "Come on, Uncle Lenny. I missed breakfast this morning. I'll split a BLT with you. How about that?" Lenny shook his head. The sad tone in the younger man's voice brought back memories of him as a child begging for money for the ice cream truck as it toiled down the street. He could picture young Marco, his chubby legs churning like mad as he fought to keep up with the other kids on the block, desperate to stake his claim to a fudge bar. The memory was in contrast to the 24-year-old who sat before him. This older Marco was chubby no longer. He had grown into a strapping young man with curly hair and a 5 o'clock shadow that made him appear even more grown up. "Can I get you, fellas, anything?" Marco smiled at the red-headed waitress, and she beamed back at him with interest. Lenny smirked, glancing briefly out the window. This was typical. Women usually fell all over Marco. He bore a strong resemblance to the actor Ryan Gosling, and Marco wasn't above working that quirk to his advantage. "Just coffee, I guess, and a Danish if you could rustle one up for me, gorgeous," said Marco, throwing in a wink for good measure. The waitress, whose name tag read Trish, smiled even bigger, revealing her smoke-stained teeth. "Sure. And you, sir?" "Just coffee is fine," replied Lenny in his rich baritone. Trish skittered away, throwing one last look over her shoulder at Marco. "Do you have to flirt with every woman we run into?" "You don't need that kind of distraction when we're on the job," said Lenny. "You're just jealous because no self-respecting woman would want to look at your ugly mug," shot back Marco with a chuckle. Lenny smiled and looked out the window again, keeping an eye on the building across the street. The window partly reflected his own image back at him. He thought his nephew was being harsh for making a joke about his looks. In reality, Lenny was holding up pretty well for a 47-year-old who had led the life he had. His short, dark hair was still mostly free of gray, with just a few wisps around the sides to remind him he was definitely on the way down the mountain, not up. The face that stared back at him was plain, but handsome, with wide-set green eyes and firm lips. His nose had been broken a few times in various scraps, but he thought its slightly misshapen look gave him character. "Who is this guy again?" asked Marco. "You need to pay better attention when we're briefing on these things." "I'm not always going to be around to watch out for you," admonished Lenny. "Sorry, geez. Who peed in your cereal this morning?" "Never mind. His name is Stuart Parsons, and he owes the family money. He was given multiple chances to pay it back and is in default." "Poor Mr. Parsons. He should have gone to a bank. They don't send guys like us to find you when you don't pay back your loans." "I don't think a bank was an option for a guy like Parsons," replied Lenny. "I suppose not." The waitress returned with the coffee and Marco's Danish, pouring each man a steaming cup. "Anything else I can get for you?" she asked, never taking her eyes off Marco. "Nothing right now, but maybe." A sharp look from Lenny cut Marco off mid-sentence, and he sighed, "Nothing, thanks." Trish walked off looking disappointed. "Did you give my dad this much shit when he was your partner?" Lenny didn't answer right away. The question sent his mind back across the years to a different time and place, a dark alley on 5th Avenue. His brother's bleeding body cradled in his arms. The hit had gone sideways in every way possible. The mark was dead, but Lenny had a bullet wound in his calf to show that he hadn't gone down without a fight. His brother had fared even worse. The man they were after was supposed to be alone, but he had a bodyguard no one had counted on. That fellow had put 2 rounds in his brother's chest before Lenny had been able to bring him down. "Lenny," whispered his brother, weakly, blood frothing across his lips. "I'm here, Paulie. I'm going to get you out of here, just hang on." A bloody hand grabbed at the sleeve of his leather jacket, pulling him closer. "Take care of my boy, Lenny. Please watch out for Marco." He had done as his brother had asked. Little Marco had been just 14 when his dad had died bleeding out in a dirty alley. The kid's mother had abandoned ship when he was still in diapers, and Polly Lucchesi had raised him practically alone. Marco had come to live with his uncle Lenny afterward, and against Lenny's advice, his nephew had chosen to follow in his father's footsteps. Being a paid assassin for the Riccoli crime family had its perks, but Lenny doubted it was the life his brother would have wanted for his only child. It was certainly a life that had begun to take a toll on Lenny, who had seen more bloodshed than he cared to remember. I never gave him more than he gave me. You're a lot like your old man. He was a smart man with a pretty face like you. Aw, thanks, Uncle Lenny. I love you too. Lenny looked back out into the haze of a dreary day. The moving crowd outside had thinned somewhat since he and Marco had taken their seats. The weather was probably discouraging people from wanting to go out. A stooped older gentleman in a worn trench coat approached the front of the hotel, and Lenny sat up higher in the booth. That's our guy. The bald dude in the trench coat? Yeah, we're going to play it like this, Marco. I'll follow him in and get the room number. This should be a quick in and out, so I need you to cover the back in case he runs. Wait, are you going it alone? How many times have you told me that two guys watching each other's backs is 100 times safer? About as many times as I've told you never question what I'm telling you to do. Just go around back and keep an eye on the exit. Okay, fine, Uncle Lenny. They waited for their mark to enter the building. Then Lenny dropped some cash on the table to pay for their order, and they left. Marco gave him a disgruntled look, but did as he was told, slipping across the street and darting down the alley next to the building to cover the back. Lenny marched straight into the lobby, taking in the shabby furniture and paint peeling from the walls. The Ritz-Carlton this place was not. Good afternoon. I'm looking for a friend, and I think I just saw him come in here. A bald guy in a trench coat. Did you see him? Lenny asked the clerk while pulling back his leather jacket enough to reveal the butt of his 9mm handgun tucked in its shoulder holster. The gun, combined with his general look, screamed mob gangster, and it was clear from how pale the clerk's skin had gone that he had made that conclusion himself. I don't want any trouble, he stammered. There won't be any if you give me the room number. The clerk looked around the lobby, licking his dry lips. 3B. Lenny nodded in a friendly way and walked over to the rickety-looking elevator, stepping inside and punching the button for the 3rd floor. The noisy mechanism cranked into life, carrying him upward. When he stepped out of the elevator, the floor was thankfully empty, and he paused to screw a silencer onto the weapon he pulled from under his jacket. The door that read 3B was so paper-thin he doubted it would provide much protection for the man on the other side. He could probably shoot him through it and not even go inside, but that wouldn't be very professional. At least there was no peephole to give his mark a heads-up on what was about to happen. He knocked softly. "Who is it?" came a scared-sounding voice from the other side. "Manager, we got a complaint about the noise coming from your room. I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't even been here until just now. Sir, could you open the door so we can talk about this like men? It's a bit ridiculous talking through a closed door." There was a long moment of silence from the other side. "If you want to be this way about it, I can always call the cops." That did the trick. "Okay, just hang on a second." The door swung open, but stopped at the end of the chain. Lenny could make out the side of Stuart Parsons' face, peeking around the corner of the aged wood. The one eye he could see widened in fear and surprise as Lenny threw his shoulder into the door, easily snapping the thin chain. Stuart went flying backward as the door slammed into his chest, landing in a heap on the floor, while Lenny calmly stepped into the room, shutting the door behind him. "Please, don't hurt me. I can pay the money back, I swear." Stuart had raised himself part way up off the floor, reaching out with one hand in supplication like a good Catholic, holding out his palm for communion. Lenny pointed his weapon, taking careful aim at the center of Stuart's head. "This isn't personal, Stuart. It's just business. You had plenty of opportunities to make restitution, so now comes the penalty for late payment. Please, I'm begging you. I swear I have the money. I just this morning got the last of it together. Please, please," begged Stuart. Lenny's finger brushed across the trigger, but he hesitated. He had been in this situation more times than he could count. It was always the same. The begging, the whining, promises that it would never happen again. This situation ended in the past with a brief muzzle flash and him vanishing like he had never existed. This was who he was, and this was the job. Yet, still, he hesitated. "Show me the money, Stuart." Shaking like an old man with palsy, Stuart managed to pull himself to his feet and opened a drawer in the chest next to him, pulling out a paper bag. He tossed it in front of Lenny, sending banded bundles of cash spilling out of the open end. "It's all there. All of it." Lenny towed the stack closest to his foot, then leaned down, careful not to take his eyes off Stuart, and put the money back into the bag, picking it up off the floor. He raised his weapon sighting right down the barrel. "By all rights, you should be a corpse right now. You understand that, right, Stuart?" The bald head nodded. "You're going to leave town, Stuart. I mean right now. You're going to leave and never show your face around here again. If I find out you're still here after midnight tonight, I will hunt you down and bury you so deep they won't find you for 1,000 years. Do you understand?" "Yes, I understand. Don't play with me on this, Stuart. I would have made it quick now. If you play with me and I catch you out, I'm going to kill you very slowly, and I promise you will die screaming. I get it. I'm gone. You will never see me again." Lenny put away his gun and moved to leave, but turned back briefly. "Oh, and I would change pants before you go." A guy walking around with piss stains down his trousers is pathetic. The rain outside had slacked off, and a few hints of sunshine were peeking through the gray clouds. Lenny sat behind the wheel while Marco sat next to him, counting the contents of Stuart Parsons's paper bag. "It's all here. I guess it was too bad he didn't get it sooner, huh?" "I guess so. Did he whine and beg before you took the shot?" "I hate when they do that. You would think at least once in a while you would meet a guy who wanted to go with a little dignity. It's easy to say that when you've never been on the other end of the barrel, kid." Marco laughed softly, dropping the closed bag between his feet. "You're in a gloomy mood today, Uncle Lenny. Must be the rain. I think the worst part is that look they get in their eyes when they know the end is coming and there ain't shit they can do about it. You know what I mean. What do you say we talk about something else, or better yet, nothing at all?" "Okay, Uncle Lenny, I get it." They drove in silence for a short while before Marco turned on the radio. He switched stations until the old car was filled with the sounds of what passed for music among America's youth today. Lenny winced. "What is this noise?" "It's called modern music, Uncle. Maybe you should try to get with the times." "I don't know how you call this music," he shot back, reaching down to adjust the dial. Lenny found an oldies station, and the music of a bygone era filled the car. "Oh man, how do you listen to this crap? It was old even when you were a kid." The music may have been old, but it brought back memories of his father. He had grown up listening to his old man play Bobby Darin records on their stereo before he left for the factory in the morning. These were the sounds of his childhood, along with the Four Seasons and the Platters. It was the music that had been the soundtrack to many family events, and now that his mom and dad were dead, it was the music that made him feel close to them again. You need to learn to appreciate the past, Marco. Just because something is old doesn't mean it has no value. Like you? Screw you, smart man. They both laughed. Lenny pulled up a short time later in front of a brick apartment building. The neighborhood was nicer than the one they had left earlier, but still far from what would be considered affluent. Marco hopped out. "Keep your nose clean tonight. I don't want to have to bail you out of jail again for getting drunk in the wrong part of town." "That was a one-time thing, Uncle Lenny." "Yeah, right. That was what you said when I got you out after that fight you had with that married lady's husband. I seem to recall that happening again a few months later. Can I help it if I'm irresistible to women? If their husbands were doing the job, they wouldn't need me. Good night, Marco." His nephew stepped back from the car, and Lenny pulled away, waving into the rear view as he turned the corner. Lenny had been in the Don's home on many occasions over the years, but never on business before today. Don Luigi Riccoli had been head of the Riccoli crime family for more than 30 years. He had risen to power after his father had died of a heart attack on a fishing trip. It was Luigi who had first recruited Lenny to work for the family when he was just 17, much to the displeasure of Lenny's father. Mike Lucchesi never wanted to see his son working for the mob, but jobs were hard to come by, and he had been forced to turn a blind eye to his eldest son's choice of vocation. When his younger son, Paulie, had followed in Lenny's footsteps, it had been even harder to bear, and Paulie's death had left Mike a shell of the man he had been. To the day he died, Mike had lamented that he didn't try harder to keep his sons away from people like Luigi Riccoli. "Come in, boys," called Don Luigi from inside his ornately decorated office. Lenny and Marco entered the room feeling like they had come for an audience with the Pope. Don Luigi had always been a short man and slight of build, but the encroaching years had made his frail appearance even more prominent. He rose unsteadily from the large leather chair where he sat behind an oak desk, coming around to shake Lenny's hand. "Lenny, you're looking good. Still in fighting trim, eh?" he said playfully, poking the bigger man in the ribs with his small fist. "I'm doing okay, Don Luigi. How about you, Marco? Staying away from the married ladies?" Marco grinned but declined to answer, merely giving a half-hearted shrug of his shoulders. Well, when I was your age, I couldn't keep it in my pants either." Lenny looked around the room at the trappings of wealth and power. He imagined that just the artworks on the walls alone could fund the running of a small city. His eyes settled on the far corner where Don Luigi's right-hand man, Carmine Salvatore, stood quietly back in the shadows. Lenny had never cared for him. For one thing, his hair lip made it appear as if his face was frozen in a permanent sneer. But even if that hadn't been the case, Carmine had a reputation for duplicity and backstabbing that was second to none. It was a puzzle why Don Luigi trusted him with so much responsibility. Lenny had often wondered if it was more a case of Don Luigi wanting to keep a watchful eye on his ambitious lieutenant, so he made sure he held him close at hand. "I'm sure you're wondering why I called you here. Since it isn't your birthday, I have to admit to some curiosity," replied Lenny. "Gentlemen, I have a problem, and I need your assistance. It's a very delicate matter and must be kept in confidence." "That goes without saying, Don Luigi." The old Don took a seat, sighing as he spoke. "I am afraid that a war may be brewing between our family and that of Don Manzano." The mention of Don Manzano brought forth a flash of memory for Lenny. He had met the head of the Manzano crime family once about 5 years earlier. A big, bull of a man with short hair slicked back on his head, Manzano had not made a favorable impression. He was a vicious sociopath who was quick to anger, and even quicker to bury anyone who he felt threatened his position. The Riccoli family had kept an uneasy truce with the Manzano family over the years based on mutual self-interest. "I'm sorry to hear that war rarely benefits either family." Too true. Many members of the family would agree with that statement. "I think this time it may be unavoidable, though. How can we help you? You want us to take him out?" "Oh, Lenny, I wish it were that easy." "I surely do," cackled Don Luigi in his high-pitched laugh that dissolved into a coughing fit. Carmine Salvatore moved for the first time since Lenny and Marco had entered the room, going to pour the old Don a glass of water and helping him sip the liquid. "Thank you, Carmine." "No, Lenny, you could never get close to Manzano. He is protected better than Fort Knox. I have a different job for you. The thing is, a certain faction in the Riccoli family, namely one run by my cousin Donnie, has seen this chaos as an opportunity to force me out. They can't do that. You can only resign. It's not like this is a democracy." "No, it isn't, but I am afraid they might try to get some leverage on me to force me to do that very thing while using my admittedly poor health as a pretext for resignation." "What could they use for leverage?" asked Lenny. "The answer to that question is where you come in." Don Luigi pressed a button under his desk, and a moment later a side door into the office opened. "I think you've met my daughter, Grace." "It's been a while." Lenny hadn't seen Grace Riccoli since her 13th birthday. She had been sent away shortly after to a boarding school in Italy. He had heard rumors of her return to the States the previous year, but this was the first time those rumors had been proven to be true. The years had indeed changed her. Gone was the skinny girl with pigtails and braces running around in her designer jeans. The Grace Riccoli that stood framed in the doorway was a full-grown woman now. She stepped into the light, and Lenny heard Marco draw in a breath. He couldn't blame him. The Don's only daughter, with his deceased wife, Christine, was a stunning beauty. She was tall and slender with the swarthy skin that befitted her southern Italian origins. Her eyes were large and such a gorgeous shade of sea green, it was like looking into a calm ocean. Grace's mother had been a beautiful woman in her own right, but she would have paled next to her daughter. "Who are these men, Papa?" asked Grace, forming her sweet, full pink lips into a frown. These are the men who are going to keep you safe, Grace. I don't need protecting, Papa. We've talked about this. And now we are through talking, said Don Luigi in a voice that was suddenly as cold as ice. This was the tone of a man used to being obeyed, and everyone in the room knew it. Lenny, my boy, this is the assignment I have for you. Went on the Don as if he had not been questioned. Carmine and I fear that someone might try to take Grace and use her as leverage to get me to step down. We have decided that it's best if she quietly got out of town for a while until we can either negotiate our way out of a fight with Manzano or win the war, whichever alternative presents itself. You want us to escort her alone? Just the two of us? Carmine thinks a large group would draw too much attention. As a matter of fact, we are going to be employing one of your favorite tactics, a bit of misdirection. You and Marco will take Grace into hiding while Carmine will send out a decoy group to make it seem like we are sending her back to Italy. I see. The plan doesn't meet with your approval, Lenny? No, it's fine as far as it goes. Good. Carmine will give you your itinerary. He has planned everything out. Grace was apparently not happy with this decision and spun on her heels, leaving the room in a huff. Carmine pulled an envelope from his pocket, handing it to Lenny. Follow the route instructions in there. I have included some traveling money. You need to stay off the radar, so no fancy hotels or restaurants. I've designed things so that you keep a low profile. Ms. Riccoli won't enjoy it, but it's safer that way. Understood, said Lenny, shoving the envelope in a jacket pocket. If there is nothing else? Marco and Carmine, would you mind waiting outside for a moment? I would like to have a private word with Lenny here. Carmine looked uncomfortable with the request, but he left the room with Marco in tow, closing the door behind them. Lenny felt instantly nervous, but tried not to show it. Would you like a drink? I just got this single malt scotch from a friend of mine who had been on a trip to the UK. It is truly excellent. No, but thank you. I never had much of a taste for booze, I'm afraid. That's right. I forgot you didn't partake of alcohol. Sorry, the older I get, the more brain cells die off. Don Luigi poured himself a drink, swishing the amber liquid around in his glass. How did that business with Stuart Parsons go? He asked casually. Fine by the book, lied Lenny, trying to keep his voice calm. Funny thing, our man at the airport swears he saw a guy who looked just like Stuart Parsons getting on an outbound flight to California last night. Isn't that strange? Whoever your man is, he needs to get some glasses. Stuart Parsons is out of the picture. I can attest to that. The old Don walked closer, looking Lenny square in the eye. It's a terrible thing when a man goes soft, loses his edge. I've seen it happen before. All those years of making the hard choices starts to wear you down. You begin to think it's time to quit and put this life aside. The thing is, Lenny, you can't quit this business. This is the life we chose, and once we're in, we're always in. Do you understand what I'm saying, Lenny? I hear you loud and clear, boss. Good. Good, Lenny. I know I can count on you to protect what's mine. Sure, was that all? Yes, Lenny, that's all. Go out there and make me proud. Lenny sighed quietly in relief and headed for the door, but Don Luigi's voice stopped him just as he grasped the handle. Oh, and Lenny? Yes, boss. If Marco makes one move on Grace, I'll have his tool in a jar. You tell him I said that, won't you? I'll tell him. For Lenny, it was like the worst family vacation he had ever been on. The more the miles rolled by, the more Grace and Marco were getting on his nerves. They had taken an instant dislike to each other, compounded by the fact that Don Luigi's edict had stripped Marco of the only thing that might have salvaged the situation. If he had thought he had a shot at getting into her pants, he would have at least remained civil. But with that gone, he quickly grew temperamental at her constant bitching. For Grace's part, it was clear she was not used to traveling anything short of first class, and the lack of butt kissing was not helping her mood. This car smells like a dead monkey. Have you ever heard of a car wash? She asked from the back seat. This was her third complaint in the last 20 miles about the condition of his car. I was given this car by my dad when I was 16. It belonged to my grandfather before that, and with careful maintenance, I have kept it going for more years than you have been alive. Think of it as a family heirloom, if that helps. The trunk in this thing is huge. Maybe you would be more comfortable in there, added Marco. Very funny. I swear if you two are the best in my father's organization, I'll be lucky to live to the next town. Look, lady, this isn't my idea of a cool Saturday outing either. But, enough, shouted Lenny. I want some quiet in this car, or I swear to Christ I'm pulling over and, Jesus, I've become my father, said Lenny, shaking his head in disgust. He tried to forestall any more arguing by switching on the radio. Bobby Darin was singing Dream Lover, and he sank back in his seat, trying to enjoy what had been one of his dad's favorite songs. What is that? It sounds like something I heard playing at my grandma's retirement home before she died, said Grace. At last. Something we can agree on, echoed Marco. This is Bobby Darin, and he happened to be one of my dad's favorite singers growing up. Is it too much to ask for some quiet? They at least let him get to the end of the song before another gripe reared its ugly head. I'm hungry, offered Grace. We're going to stop in a Corona and get a bite to eat, okay? Actually, I'm kind of hungry too. What if we pulled off at the next exit? I think I saw a sign for a restaurant, said Marco. You two can hang on to a Corona. It's only another hour. They rolled another 2 miles before. I'm seriously getting hungry. Shit, shouted Lenny. Marco looked over into the back seat. Watch it. Daddy's getting mad. Marco and Grace both broke into gales of laughter, while Lenny felt his face going red. This is going to be a long trip, he thought. In the end, Lenny took the exit and found a small, family-run restaurant along the side of the road. It took Grace Ricolai all of 30 seconds to declare within earshot of the entire establishment that the place should be condemned, and there was no way she was going to eat anything cooked in what had to be a rat haven in the kitchen. Pipe down and sit, snapped Lenny tiredly. I'm going to pee first. I hope I don't get syphilis off the toilet. Grace snapped right back as she walked away. We should be so lucky, mumbled Marco as he perused the menu. You could be making this easier, Marco, said Lenny. I can't help it if the mafia princess from hell keeps baiting me. Grow up. We have to spend the next couple of days together, so we need to call a truce on all the sniping. Tell her that. I plan to. He caught sight of Grace as she made her way back from the restroom, her scowl perfectly in place. The fact that she was wearing a knit shirt tight enough was eye-catching, but it didn't make her constant bad attitude easier to take. She threw herself into the booth next to Lenny, refusing to make eye contact with either man as she looked down at her menu. The perfume she was wearing was quite alluring, and it made Lenny's head swim as he tried to focus on his menu. The chicken fried steak looks good, he remarked out loud. You have any idea how they prepare processed chicken these days? It's appalling what they do to those poor animals, said Grace. Oh, wow. Are you one of those vegetarians? Asked Marco. It's vegetarian, moron. You should try it. It's better for you and the planet. Lenny could see this devolving quickly. All right, for the duration of this meal, I'm calling a moratorium on any fighting, name-calling, or baiting. Let's have a nice, friendly meal, okay? Fine, said Grace tightly. Marco managed a nod, but sulked lower in his seat. Their waitress arrived a moment later. She was a petite blonde with a country accent. What can I get for you folks? Well, sweetheart, you could start with your phone number, replied Marco with a smile. The waitress grinned back at him while Grace rolled her eyes and uttered an, "Oh, brother," under her breath. They eventually got their drink orders in, and after the waitress left, Grace took the opportunity to go after Marco again, though in a more conversational tone than she had used up till then. Do you hit on every woman that crosses your path? Why? Are you jealous? Easy, warned Lenny. Oh, right. Because my idea of a dream man is a wise guy in a leather jacket with a high school education. I had 2 years at community college, said Marco, his voice rising. Good for you, Marco. What was the last book you read? Sally and Spot Play Hide the Pickle. Did it at least have pictures? Oh, excuse me, Miss High and Mighty. Sorry that Daddy couldn't pay for me to go to school in Italy. What did you study? How to lay on my back in 10 easy lessons. Thankfully, the waitress returned before things could get worse. The group placed their orders, and Lenny got up to make a phone call, checking in with Carmine and letting him know everything was going smoothly so far, minus the part about how he might kill both Marco and Grace, saving Donnie Ricolai the trouble. Things were quiet when he returned, and he went to eat his burger, praying that the peace lasted for the rest of the meal. He should have known he wouldn't get that lucky. I'm tired of riding in the back. I get carsick if I have to sit back there too long, complained Grace. How about the roof? Think you would get carsick tied to the roof? Offered Marco. You can ride up front for the next leg of the trip if it makes you feel better, cut in Lenny. Give me a break, Marco, sighed his uncle. Lenny left a tip on the table and took the check up front to pay. They got back in the car with Grace taking the passenger seat and Marco stretching out in back. Thankfully, Marco fell asleep after a few miles, and except for some occasional loud snoring, things were quiet in the car. The countryside went by in a blur while Grace watched it out the side window. This must be a strange place for you to be in being a city boy, she observed. I've spent some time in the country, replied Lenny. Really? Yeah. When I was growing up, my grandfather had a cabin up in the Catskills. We used to go there every summer and hang out. It was peaceful without all the city noise in your ears. I took Marco a few times after his dad died. I think it helped get his mind off things. That was your brother, Paulie, right? Lenny nodded. What was he like? He was a lot like Marco, to be honest. The apple didn't fall far from the tree. They both have that innate charm that the ladies just love, along with a sense of humor that can get on your nerves. I guess you take the good with the bad. So, is there a Mrs. Lucchesi? How does she like your line of work? There's no Mrs. Lucchesi. My line of work, as you put it, kind of precludes relationships, or at least makes them difficult. Sounds like a lonely life, she observed. I don't really think about it. Never. What would be the point? We are what we are. You decide at some point in your life to be on a certain path and become a certain person, and then you live with it. You don't think a person can change? That circumstances can open up that point you in a direction you didn't expect. Maybe, I don't know. I try to keep things simple. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about fate or stuff like that. It just gets confusing. If you had the opportunity to do it over, would you still be the person you are now? Lenny stopped to think about that, catching the sight of his own eyes staring back at him from the rearview mirror. Would he do it again given the same choice? Before yesterday, he would have been sure about the answer, but after that moment with Stuart Parsons, it didn't seem so clear anymore. He had never doubted his place in the bigger scheme of things when he was younger, but Luigi had been right that the more hard choices you made, the more they weighed on you. The burden of sin Lenny carried now felt some days like a 10-ton load on his back. He sighed deeply, taking one hand off the wheel to rub at his tired eyes. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you blow a gasket in your brain, said Grace with a light laugh. Don't worry about it. I'm just getting old, I guess. You don't look so old to me. I wish I felt as good as I look then, he said with a laugh of his own. Why don't you two keep it down? Some of us are trying to sleep, groaned Marco from the back seat. He gets cranky when he doesn't get his nap, explained Lenny, making Grace laugh louder. Their itinerary had them hunkering down at a motel in the city of Bostwick for the night. Carmine had picked the hotel for them near the center of downtown. It was a rundown flea bag called the Sleep Easy, and just the sight of it made Grace shudder. This is where we're sleeping? I know it's not up to your usual standards, but that is the point. No one would think to look for you here. Marco got them a key to their room. One room, said Grace incredulously. Don't worry, princess. I will let you be the big spoon, said Marco. Like hell, started Grace. Hold it. You won't be sharing a bed with anyone. There are 2 queens and Marco, and I will be sleeping in shifts, so everyone relax, said Lenny. I want my own room, said Grace defiantly. I want her to have her own room too, added Marco. No one is getting their own room. Jesus, you two are driving me nuts. Let's just bed down for the night and try to start fresh in the morning. The room wasn't as bad as they expected. It was no 5-star hotel, but the sheets were clean, and the shower had plenty of hot water. Do we flip a coin to see who showers first? Asked Marco. I'll happily defer to you, Marco. I've been downwind of you for half the trip, said Grace, throwing herself down on one of the beds. Okay, fine. I will try and save you some hot water. Unless you want to try a little conservation effort by showering with me? Grace flipped him off, and Marco smirked back at her. Hey, I thought you were trying to save the planet. I'm going to step outside and check and try not to knife Marco in the shower while I'm gone, said Lenny. A few stars were starting to appear in the early evening sky as Lenny dialed his cell phone. Carmine Salvatore answered on the second ring. Hey, Carmine, still eating out of the corner of your mouth? Don Luigi's lieutenant refused to rise to the bait. Did you make it to Bostwick? Yeah, we're all checked in. The trip has been uneventful so far. Good. I think it was advisable that you got out of town when you did. Oh, yes. The word on the street is the Calavari brothers were seen in the city around the same time. Is that right? Replied Lenny, trying to keep his voice calm, but feeling a twinge of apprehension creeping up his spine. Jimmy and Max Calavari were the boogeymen of the underworld. A couple of heavy hitters who ran a small crew of assassins that had an unsavory reputation for enjoying their work a little too much. The brothers were often used as a threat to keep unruly mob employees in line. Do right by the family, or the Calavari will come for you. They were free agents and had supposedly worked for a number of different families over the years. You think Donnie would stoop to hiring the Calavari brothers to put the grab on Grace? I don't know, but I would be on your guard just the same. Anyway, it's just a rumor, and we did a good job of throwing anyone looking for you off the scent, so there shouldn't be a problem. Okay, fine. I will check in again tomorrow. Good night, Lenny. The phone went silent, and Lenny tucked it into his jacket pocket, heading back into the room. By the time he returned, Marco had finished his shower and was sitting on the bed in a t-shirt and jeans. Grace had gone in after him, and Lenny could hear the shower running. You talked to Carmine? Yep, and he gave me an interesting tidbit. It looks like the Calavari brothers were seen in town. You know, I always thought you looked a lot like Jimmy. Don't put that sadistic prick and I in the same sentence, said Lenny angrily, although sadly he had to agree that he and Jimmy Calavari did look an awful lot alike. I'm not worried. If they cross our path, we will put them both in the ground, and their crew right along with them. Look who's so full of confidence. If we run into the Calavari brothers, the smart play would be to duck down and run like hell. Who are we talking about? Asked Grace, coming out of the bathroom. She was wearing a long, dark gray t-shirt over her body, and Lenny tried very hard not to stare. Grace was rubbing at her wet hair with a towel. Nothing. I was saying that Carmine was happy with our progress, and everything is fine back home. No war with Manzano yet? Apparently not. Grace returned to her bed, sitting down on the edge. I'm going to grab a shower. We sleep in shifts tonight, Marco. You can go first, and I will wake you at 1 a.m., okay? Sounds good. The princess can tell me a bedtime story while you're gone. Screw you, said Grace. Oh, that's one of my favorites, commented Marco as he curled up with a spare pillow. Lenny shook his head for what seemed like the umpteenth time that day and went into the bathroom, closing the door behind him. By the time he showered, Marco had drifted off to sleep. Lenny stopped in the dim light from the television. He could make out Grace Riccoli sitting up under the blankets of her bed, her back propped up on a pillow. Anything good on? I was thinking about buying one of these, but Masters. Only 3 payments of $19.99 and guaranteed to make my look terrific. I don't think you have an issue there, said Lenny. Why, Mr. Lucchesi, are you paying me a compliment? Lenny suddenly felt embarrassed at his off-the-cuff remark and tried to change the subject. We're making good time, so you won't have to put up with Marco and me much longer. I don't mind so much. I'm sure you're just as ready to be rid of me. I know I'm not the easiest person to get along with on a trip, or any other time for that matter. You're fine. I've been around worse. Really? When exactly? During a prison riot? I admit you are an acquired taste. Spend enough time around me, and you will long to send me away like my father does so often. He is just watching out for you. Family is everything. Grace looked over at the sleeping Marco. That may be true, but now I know why some species eat their young. Ouch. Marco is not so bad. He can be a brat, but he only teases people he likes. What does he do to people he doesn't like? Shoots them, said Lenny. Grace laughed, even though she wasn't sure whether Lenny was serious or not. My dad calls you Lucky Lucchesi sometimes. Why is that? Because I've been shot twice, stabbed 4 times, and had part of my hair burned off by a Molotov cocktail. That's why he calls you Lucky? Yeah, after all that, I'm lucky to be alive. You're funny, Lenny. I don't think I've met many funny hit men. My original plan was to go into stand-up comedy, but it didn't pan out. Is that what my father saved you from? Lenny got quiet, thinking back to his violent youth, and the man who had seen the opportunity in a kid who was so good at dishing it out. Your dad saw a kid in a tough neighborhood fighting to survive. There weren't enough jobs to go around, and I wasn't much of a student, so I wasn't going to get out that way. He gave me a hand up, then sent you down a path of murder and mayhem. It's not for everybody, Lenny said quietly. I get the impression you're not as at peace with your place in this world as you let on. You trying to psychoanalyze me, Ms. Riccoli? You can call me Grace, Lenny, and no, I'm just making an observation. Try observing the back of your eyelids. We have a long drive ahead of us tomorrow. Be that way about it, Lenny. A little introspection can be good for the soul. She clicked off the TV and rolled over on her side, while Lenny stretched out to take his turn at guarding the room. Grace was asleep in record time. He could just make out her face that was even more beautiful in its calm repose. How long had it been since the last time he had been with a woman? He couldn't recall exactly, maybe at Don Luigi's birthday party 2 years earlier, but his memory on the subject was hazy at best. I should have my head examined for even thinking it. Luigi would have my tool in that jar right next to Marco's, thought Lenny. He stretched his arms over his head and glanced at the clock by the bed. It was a long way to 1 a.m. Who do you have to get a cup of coffee around here? Said Grace Riccoli irritably. The line starts here, laughed Marco as he tied his shoes. Grace didn't even dignify his latest crude remark with a reply. Marco is going to fetch us some breakfast while we finish packing, don't worry about it. Cut in Lenny in a reasonable tone. A night's sleep had done him good, and Lenny felt slightly better prepared to deal with another day of being caught in the middle of Marco and Grace's war of words. I want mine with cream and 2 sugars, said Grace. She needs the sugar to offset all that vinegar she's filled with, whispered Marco to Lenny as he walked by. Don't be all day about getting the food. I want to get on the road. No problem. Uncle, I will be back in a flash. Marco went out the door, which banged shut behind him. Do you need all this shit just to travel for a few days? Asked Lenny as he sat on her suitcase to get it closed. Yes, I do. You should see me when I go overseas, replied Grace as she went into the bathroom to pack her beauty supplies. I can't even imagine. Lenny started to lift the heavy suitcase off the bed, but it slipped in his hand and tumbled onto the floor. He sighed in frustration and bent over to pick it up. In retrospect, it was this tiny, fateful movement that saved his life. An explosion that shook the hotel immediately followed the sounds of his grandfather's car starting out front. The window of their room blew inward, sending wicked shards of glass, cutting through the air while the blast wave knocked the TV off the wall and overturned the lighter furniture. Grace screamed from the bathroom, but Lenny barely heard her, his ears ringing from the sound of the blast. He staggered to his feet, looking out the ruined window at his car, or at least what was left of it wreathed in flames. Marco, he screamed. The front door had blown back on its hinges, and Lenny darted through the doorway, but he couldn't get anywhere near the car that was a raging inferno. He stood helpless, watching his nephew's funeral pyre burn brightly in the early morning sky. Oh, God, Marco, he whispered. Time seemed to stand still in the parking lot, but it wasn't long before all his years of experience took over, and it occurred to Lenny Lucchesi that he couldn't just stand there. This fact was made even more imperative when he happened to turn to his left and saw 2 dark-haired gentlemen exiting a sedan not 50 feet away. It was Jimmy and Max Calavari. Son of a bitch, snapped Lenny. He turned on his heel, running back into the room and drawing his pistol as he crossed the threshold. Grace was standing in the bathroom doorway, her face still in an expression of shock. Poor Marco, is he? Worry about Marco later. Run now, yelled Lenny, pushing her back through the door of the bathroom. He slammed the door behind them, locking it, and turned to kick out the bathroom window. He used a towel to cover the edges of the broken glass and climbed through into what turned out to be an alley between the hotel and the office building next door. Grace stuck her head through the window, and he motioned for her to follow. She slipped, trying to climb out and be bent over to help her to her feet, just as a spray of bullets punched through the bathroom door. Lenny returned the fire, blindly shooting several holes of his own. "Hall shit," he shouted at Grace. The pair fled down the alley, with Lenny throwing constant looks over his shoulder. They hit the end of the alley just as Jimmy Calavari poked his head out the window, spotting them. "This way. Stay up with me." "I'm trying," wailed Grace. They ran like crazy, with Grace doing a respectable job of keeping pace despite having to run in designer boots. Lenny cut across the street and down another alley, then back up the next street over, trying to throw as many twists and turns as he could into the route to confuse pursuit. "We can't stay on foot, we need to find some transportation," he said, panting with the exertion of running. He slipped his gun back under his jacket, not wanting to draw unwanted attention, and made Grace slow to a walk as they entered a busier area surrounded by shopping centers and markets. Lenny knew what he was looking for, and his eyes darted around the different parking lots. Modern technology had made the old-fashioned notion of hot wiring a car a thing of the past, so he needed an older model. He got lucky on the third lot they passed. The pickup was a classic, and it took Lenny's practiced fingers less than 10 seconds from the time he punched through the driver's side window to have the engine roaring to life. Grace climbed into the passenger seat, and he drove carefully out of the lot, making sure to obey the speed limit. They hit the main road 5 minutes later and were out of town shortly after that. Lenny had kept his cool to this point, but he suddenly struck the wheel violently with his hand over and over at least a dozen times, cursing at the top of his lungs. Grace endured the display of fury silently. "What just happened?" she finally asked in a subdued voice. "My nephew was just murdered right in front of me," said Lenny, staring straight ahead. "I'm sorry, Lenny, but I don't understand. Why would they bomb our car? Donnie wants me alive." "I doubt this was Donnie. It stinks of Manzano. Maybe this was his way of making sure he gets the war he wants, or an opening gambit to throw your father off his game by killing you. How would he even know where I was?" "Carmine," said Lenny through clenched teeth. "It had to be him. He was the only one who knew the route and where we would be." "You think he is thrown in with Manzano?" "It's the only explanation that makes sense. I can tell you one thing. When I catch up with that son of a bitch, I'm going to gouge out his eyes and cut him to shreds." This declaration was followed by more violent abuse of the steering wheel. Grace waited for Lenny to calm down before she continued. "What do we do now?" "We have to come up with a new plan. The itinerary is out the window, obviously, so we will need to lay low someplace else. Somewhere they would never think to look for you. Any ideas?" "One may be first. We need a legit car, not one we stole. At the next big town, we find a rental place. I still have Carmen's walking around money, so we can pay cash. Then," Lenny took a slow breath, trying to calm himself, "then we get some supplies and lay low until I can figure a way to get a message to your father that Carmine won't intercept." They drove in stunned silence for a short while longer. "I am really sorry about Marco. I know it seemed like I hated him, but don't worry about it. He liked you too," said Lenny. "These guys that are after us? The Calavari brothers. They're bad news, that's for sure. They have a 4-person crew. Besides themselves, there's this explosives expert, a little red-haired troll named Barry Sutter, and their wheelman Tommy Abalone. So it's 4 against 1? "Don't worry, I've faced worse odds," said Lenny, trying to sound confident. "Seriously?" replied Grace, and he could hear the unspoken fear in her tone. Lenny reached across the seat and took her trembling hand. "I promise you, Grace, no one is going to hurt you." This time the conviction shone in his eyes, and Grace pulled back slightly at the predatory look she found there. She had no doubt he would kill anyone who got in his way. They ditched the pickup in the next town and rented a 4-wheel drive. Lenny was careful to pay cash and used a fake ID for the vehicle under the name Manischewitz. With Grace's help, he bought food at a local grocery store and then set out on a new route. The scenery slowly changed as they drove, becoming first more hilly and then heavily wooded. "Where are we?" "The Catskills," explained Lenny. It had been a long time since he had driven out this way, but he found himself following the correct route without thinking about it. The closer he got to his grandfather's old cabin, the more the memories of his childhood came flooding back to him. When he pulled in front of the old structure, he could easily picture his mom and dad sitting on the front porch, listening to oldies and watching the sunset while he and his brother wrestled in the grass. "It's beautiful up here," remarked Grace. She looked around at all the trees, many of them sporting flowery growths heralding the spring season. "Help me unpack," asked Lenny. The cabin was a bit musty from disuse, but still quite livable. He and Grace worked into the evening, cleaning things up before sitting down for a meal. Grace had bought all the fixings for some excellent spaghetti, and she did her Italian heritage proud by delivering a very savory dish. Lenny pushed away from the table, rubbing his belly. I have to say that may have been the most delicious meal I've had in ages. It was my mom's recipe. You look like her, only prettier, said Lenny without thinking, and then he immediately blushed in embarrassment. Grace took his compliment in stride and merely laughed and said, "Thanks." They cleaned up the dirty dishes together, and Lenny was once again reminded of his parents. He had memories of them washing dishes in the kitchen at the end of a meal. Mom cleaning while Dad stood next to her drying them off with a towel. They had been a perfect unit, his mom and Dad. He placed the last dish back in its place in the cupboard while Grace poured him a glass of tea. They moved out into the living room and took seats on opposite sides of the sofa. The walls were covered with old photos of Lenny and his family, and Grace glanced around the room. "Oh my God, is that you?" she said, laughing and pointing at a photo of a young man of maybe 8 years of age covered in mud. "Yeah, Polly tripped me. The little shit. There is a lot of history upon these walls. My mother was big on photographing everything. It was kind of a hobby for her, but not one she got a chance to indulge much in the city. She loved her camera and Dad loved his music. The golden oldies? Yeah, here I can show you." Lenny sat aside his drink and walked across the room, pulling a drop cloth off an antique-looking phonograph. "My grandfather fixed this up after he found it in a junkyard in the city," explained Lenny. The old crank made a soft grinding noise as Lenny turned it round and round. When he dropped the needle down, the sounds of the platters singing, "Only You," filled the room. "It was my mom and dad's song," said Lenny. He looked down at the old record going in circles and wondered if his parents were together in some better place still listening to it. A hand touched his shoulder, and he turned around to find Grace standing right behind him. "May I have this dance?" she said, smiling. Lenny laughed. It felt good after all they had been through that day. He put one arm around Grace's waist and took her opposite hand in his while leading her out into the room. They danced in time to the music. Grace was smiling up at him, and if he had ever seen a more beautiful woman in his life, he couldn't recall when. They turned slowly, and Grace grew closer until her head rested on his chest, and he had released her hand, putting both arms around her. "This feels nice," she whispered. The sweet smell of her hair filled his nose, and his heart started to beat faster in his chest. When the song ended, Grace made no move to pull away, and they stayed together in the middle of the room. Lenny cleared his throat. "We should probably get some rest. You can, take the bed. I'll be fine out here." Grace pulled back enough to look up at him. "I think you would be a lot finer in the bed with me," she said. Before Lenny could come up with an answer, she stood on her toes and kissed him. Lenny returned her kiss without thinking, pulling her tighter to him. They quickly started to kiss more passionately, a hunger for each other growing between them. Lenny rocked backward, suddenly breaking away in a panic. "What's wrong?" asked Grace in confusion. "Jesus, Grace, your dad will kill me. I don't want my tool to end up in a jar." "Oh, he threatens men all the time with that line, but he's never actually done it. At least not as far as I know. Seriously, I should probably sleep on the couch." Grace smiled a wicked-looking smile, and to Lenny's dismay, she started to unbutton her blouse. "You should sleep on the couch, huh? I guess that's one way to go." The blouse drifted back off her shoulders, dropping to the floor. Lenny's heart skipped a beat as Grace started closing the distance between them. "I hate the thought of you sleeping out here by yourself. It could get cold tonight, and what would you do then?" "Blanket," said Lenny in a strangled voice. "Would you rather cuddle with a blanket, or—" Lenny couldn't speak for a full 5 seconds. They say there is no such thing as a stupid question, but Lenny realized whoever said that was full of shit. He grabbed Grace and pulled her and gave her a hot French kiss. They made love. Lenny was not a morning person, and he groaned and threw an arm across his eyes, trying to keep out the sun. "It's about time you woke up. Breakfast is going to get cold," said Grace from the bedroom doorway. He could smell the telltale odor of bacon from the other room, and this, at last, forced him up. The old wood floor was cold, and he stopped to dress and pull on some shoes before joining Grace in the kitchen. "Look at you, Miss Susie Homemaker. I didn't realize you were so domestic. Don't get used to it. I usually have servants to do this for me, but Mom taught me to make a few things." Lenny settled himself at the table and dug into his plate, enjoying the smoky flavor of the bacon on his tongue. "Do we have a plan yet?" asked Grace. "I'm working on it. I think our best bet might be to stay low for at least a week until the heat dies down, then work our way back to the city. I'm not sure what to do after that. Is there anyone you know we could reach out to? It would have to be someone with access to Don Luigi that Carmine couldn't block. I don't know, maybe my Aunt Vivian, but she and Dad are kind of on again off again. Well, think about it. I had a good time last night, said Grace, setting down her coffee. Yeah, me too, offered Lenny, reaching over to take one of her soft hands. Lenny, have you ever considered getting out? I mean, trying to put this life behind you. And do what exactly? There aren't a lot of jobs for guys with a resume that says former mob hitman on it. I get that, but this life is going to kill you eventually. I don't know many retired hitmen either. It's sweet that you care, he said. I do, she replied, smiling. Lenny pulled his hand back, frowning. It's a nice idea, but I have to be realistic. Your father would never let me go. I know too much, and I've seen too many things. Maybe I could talk to him? What would you say? Hey, Papa, I know this kind, handsome hitman who is amazing in bed. Let's cut him a break and let him retire away from all the killing and shit. Very funny. I was just trying to help, said Grace, getting up from the table. I know, said Lenny, his voice trailing off. This was the first time he had ever truly considered walking away, but didn't see how he would do it. The only retirement men like him knew was at the bottom of a grave. He turned to apologize for his sarcastic reply and stopped dead at the sight of a red, glowing dot on her forehead. Down! He screamed, leaping up from the table and tackling Grace around the knees. She fell sideways across the kitchen while a bullet meant for her brain slammed into the far wall. The two of them hugged the floor as the single sniper round was followed shortly by a hail of automatic gunfire that rattled across the heavy wooden walls outside the cabin. What the hell? Yelled Lenny. He pulled Grace closer to him, holding her as broken glass from the kitchen window spilled down upon them. How did they know? Asked Grace in a voice that shook with fear. I don't know, shouted Lenny in anger and confusion. This place had nothing to do with Grace. How the hell did the bad guys find them here? It was a question to worry about later, assuming they survived, Lenny realized. Stay low, crawl and follow me. Lenny squirmed around on his belly, then crawled from the kitchen to the living room. Grace was right behind him, slithering on her belly like a snake. When he reached the other room, he grabbed his shoulder holster off the back of the chair where he had left it the night before, pulling his gun free and tipping the chair over on himself in the process. He cursed as the dents wood smacked into his shoulders. Shit, he said, pushing the chair aside. We're screwed, aren't we? Said Grace, crawling up next to him. Not yet, and even if we are, I'm not going down without taking a few of them with me, said Lenny tightly. The fusillade of gunfire was continuing, but as he steeled himself for the fight ahead, Lenny's tactical experience began to kick in. You notice something? What? All their fire is hitting only the north and west walls of the house. What does that mean? It means that's where they want our attention focused. The east side of the cabin is a blank wall, so that just leaves, stay here. Lenny crawled as fast as he could across the floor and up the short hallway leading toward the bedrooms. Here he was sheltered from the gunfire, and he stood upright listening to his aging joints pop. He threw open the door to the first bedroom and found nothing. The room was stacked with boxes he used for storage, but the window was intact. The door to the room his parents used to occupy when he was a kid flew back on its hinges with a single kick. There was a man in the window, one leg in the cabin and the other still dangling outside. He had shaggy red hair that fell in a messy tangle around his massive head, and a face only a mother could love. In his hand, he had a gun, but at the moment it was pointed at the floor while he struggled to pull himself into the cabin. Hey, Barry, shouted Lenny. Barry Sutter looked up in surprise, freezing for a moment and failing to react to the danger in front of him. This is for my car. You lousy, no good, scumsucker. Lenny fired 3 rounds in rapid succession, hitting Barry dead on with all of them. His limp body tumbled back out the window. The gunfire outside the cabin stopped as soon as Barry Sutter's corpse hit the ground. Lenny raced over to the broken window, but saw no one moving in the woods to the south. He ran over to the closet, opening it, and grabbing his father's old camouflage jacket, pulling it on over his shirt. Then he took down a box off the top shelf, opening it to bring out 2 more handguns, slamming a clip into each one, and shoving one into his pants at the small of his back. "What's going on?" Grace stood in the bedroom doorway, her face as pale as a ghost. "I told you to stay on the living room floor." They stopped firing. "I know they're coming up with a new plan." "Like what?" He started to answer when a sizzling noise broke the silence, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Lenny leaned out to look up the hallway where a metal cylinder lay on the floor with greasy-looking smoke pouring out of it. "Probably like that," he said. The bedroom door swung shut as he turned back to Grace. "What is it?" "Tear gas. They're trying to flush us out." "What do we do?" "We don't have a choice. We run like hell and figure things out as we go." "Come on." Lenny went out the window first, diving and rolling. He came up in a crouch, spotting a second man to his right, coming around the corner of the house. The years he had spent in the service of the Riccoli family caused his body to go on autopilot, and he was firing before the thought even entered his mind. The man in his sights ducked back, wildly, narrowly avoiding getting hit. "Move your butt, Grace," shouted Lenny. She came out of the window, and he nodded at the woods before they both took off running. He could see two men following them now, dark shapes that moved in the trees behind them as they ran. An occasional burst of machine gun fire ripped through the branches above them, egging them on. "Please, I have to stop," begged Grace. Lenny pulled her down behind a fallen tree trunk, glancing back the way they had come. He could barely see the men following them, but even his slight movement above the cover of the tree was greeted with another hail of bullets, sending a shower of loose branches down onto his head. "They're going to kill us," said Grace sullenly. "Someone might, but I don't think it's going to be them," said Lenny, looking around. "What are you talking about?" "They're firing high on purpose. They aren't trying to hit us, they're trying to drive us." "Drive us where?" Lenny looked at the trail ahead. The woods thinned out about 100 yards distant, and he could make out the open clearing beyond. A low ridge line followed the far side of the open space. "I think they're trying to force us into the open. I'll bet anything they sent their sniper out that way. It would be an easy shot from the top of that ridge once they have us in the open." "What do we do then?" "Take these," said Lenny, and he handed two of his guns to Grace, keeping his original pistol for himself. While she looked on, he screwed his silencer onto the end. "I've never fired a gun before in my life," wailed Grace. "You don't have to hit them, just keep them busy. Stagger your fire, so it looks like we're shooting together. I need them to think we are both still here." "Where are you going?" "The one advantage we have is I know these woods, and they don't. Just trust me." "Lenny, it's going to be okay. I promised no one would hurt you, and I meant it," he said, reaching up to touch one of her cheeks briefly. "Give me a 10 count and start shooting." Lenny pulled the hood of the camouflage jacket up over his head, and as soon as Grace opened fire, he crawled into the woods behind them. The thick foliage combined with the jacket made him hard to spot, and he stayed low, racing across the ground to swing wide of where their pursuers were laying down a steady rain of return fire on Grace's position. He knew he didn't have much time before she would run out of ammo, and they would move in to flush her out again. He picked up the old game trail that his father had led him down many times as a kid, using it to backtrack and get behind the men following them. It ran right alongside an old culvert that he used to stay out of sight. When he emerged from it moments later, he could see the backs of their two assailants. Taking a deep breath, Lenny picked his way forward, trying only to move when the two men were firing to minimize the noise. The sound of Grace's return fire stopped, and he knew he was out of time. The man closest to him squeezed off another burst from his submachine gun, and Lenny used the sound to cover one last lunge forward that brought him to within a few feet of his adversary. He recognized the scarred head of Max Calavari. When the second man, who he assumed to be Max's brother Jimmy, fired again, Lenny calmly put a single round into the back of Max's head, blowing his brain all over the ground in front of him. So much for the bad shit boogeyman, thought Lenny. One down. Lenny continued toward Jimmy, who had stopped to reload. He didn't have a clear shot because of the trunk of a gnarled oak tree that stood between them, so he had to step to his left. The stick that lay under the leaves his foot came down on made a noise much quieter than all the shooting that had been going on, but it sounded like a bugle call in the silence of the forest. Jimmy Calavari whipped around, leveling his weapon at Lenny, who had been thrown off balance and had his gun pointing uselessly at the ground. Well, lucky Lenny Lucchesi. Not so lucky anymore, are you?" I would say your brother's luck ran out before mine, replied Lenny. Jimmy looked over at where his brother's dead body lay on the ground. You shithead, screamed Jimmy Calavari as he yanked at the trigger. Lenny closed his eyes. The only real regret he felt at the end was in breaking his promise to protect Grace. Jimmy's gun barked once and jammed. The single round he got off ripped through the arm of Lenny's jacket, turning him partway around with so much force that his gun flew out of his hand. He lost sight of it in the loose underbrush and turned to find Jimmy fighting with the bolt on his weapon. Lenny let out a yell like a crazed animal and covered the distance in 4 long strides, tackling the younger man, and they went crashing to the ground together. The 2 men thrashed around with Jimmy, tossing the useless gun aside and going after Lenny with his fists. They battered each other with a series of hard blows before Jimmy managed to gain the advantage of leverage and pushed Lenny off, sending him sprawling into a bush. Lenny got back to his feet while Jimmy yanked a wicked-looking knife from his belt, and he followed suit, popping open a worn switchblade he pulled from a jacket pocket. I'm going to gut your sorry bum Lucchesi, and then I'm going to screw that Riccoli bitch before I kill her. You're such a sick shit, Calavari. No one is going to miss you. The 2 men squared off. Jimmy was 10 years younger and the stronger of the 2. Lenny had the advantage of experience and some serious righteous indignation. They stalked around in a circle, each man taking an occasional swipe at the other before Jimmy broke the stalemate with a hard charge. They came together in a crash of glittering blades and wild punches, and when they came apart, Lenny was limping from a deep gash across his upper thigh. I told you, I'm going to bury this in your bum, yelled Jimmy, waving his knife. Funny, I used to say that to your mother, shot back Lenny. Jimmy's face turned bright red, and he charged again. At the last moment, Lenny ducked low and took the younger man around the middle. He got a nasty cut across his shoulder, but managed to stick Jimmy twice in the gut with his switchblade before throwing him backward. The shock of his stab wounds slowed him just enough that Lenny was able to block his knife hand as he closed in again to drive his blade into Jimmy's chest. The last Calavari brother staggered backward, looking down in surprise at the knife protruding from him. I'll be damned, he muttered and dropped to the ground. I'm sure you will, answered Lenny. Lenny, called Grace. It's okay, you can come out. She joined him, looking down at the dead body of Jimmy Calavari, then promptly spitting on him. I feel the same way, said Lenny, swaying slightly. Oh, shit. Lenny, you're hurt. No kidding, I hadn't noticed, said Lenny sarcastically as Grace got one of his arms over her shoulders and tried to help him along. We need to get to the car and get out of here. Tommy Abalone might still be lurking out there. Grace guided him back to the cabin, insisting that they at least stop long enough to get a towel to stop the flow of blood from Lenny's wounds. He leaned against the wall while she ran some water onto a cloth she grabbed from under the sink. I still don't get how they even knew we were here. It doesn't make any sense. No, I don't suppose it would, said a voice from the front door of the cabin. Grace and Lenny both stopped what they were doing, unable to fathom what their eyes were telling them, even as the newcomer stepped into the light. I didn't expect to see you again, Uncle Lenny, said Marco as he covered the 2 of them with a handgun he held at arm's length. A long-barreled sniper rifle was slung across Marco's back, and he was dressed from head to toe in green camo. You died, the car, stammered Grace. All part of the plan. Misdirection, right, Uncle Lenny. The first lesson you ever taught me. Why, Marco? I don't understand. It's not so complicated. Manzano gets his war, and I get a nice fat payday. Of course, the money wouldn't do me much good if Don Luigi thought I crossed him, so I had to die. You know, death doesn't feel so bad after all, said Marco, looking down at his body and smiling. You gave an oath to the family? Choked out Lenny, still in shock over seeing his nephew alive. The family. The same family that sent my dad into an alley to die. For what? So the Don could go on piling up wealth while they treat us like pieces on a chessboard. They push us around and make us kiss their rings. And what is at the end of the rainbow? All we have to look forward to is bleeding out on a filthy street. Marco, your dad, my brother. No one is more sorry about what happened to him than me, but he made his choice. And now so have I, yelled Marco, cutting his uncle off. I get to walk away, and as a bonus, I get to take the one thing that Don Luigi truly loves away from him, the same way he took my dad away from me. Marco walked closer, his face turning grim and angry. "I will make this quick for you, princess. It's more than you deserve." "No, Marco!" cried Lenny, and he leapt at his nephew. Lenny's bad legged slowed his movement, and Marco was able to dodge aside, striking his uncle across the neck with the butt of his gun, sending him sprawling to the ground. "Nice try, uncle." He turned back to finish what he started, and got hit right in the face by a steel frying pan. "Eat shit, you prick," shouted Grace. The blow busted Marco's nose, but he recovered with the reflexes of a born killer. His fist came around, catching Grace on the jaw, and she flew backward, crashing into the wooden breakfast table and rolling off to one side onto her hands and knees. She tried to rise, but Marco was on her before she could pull herself together. He yanked her to her feet and drove his fist into her face a second time, sending her into the kitchen counter. Grace dropped to the floor unconscious. "Oh God, you broke my nose," yelled Marco to her unmoving body. He turned to finish things with his uncle first and stopped. Where his uncle had fallen, there was nothing but an empty floor and a thin trail of blood leading to the front door. "Son of a bitch. Is nothing ever easy?" said Marco to himself. He knew he couldn't afford to let his uncle escape. If word got out that he was still alive, Don Luigi would never stop looking for him, and he didn't relish the idea of spending the rest of his life on the run. "Sleep tight, little bitch. I'll be right back." Marco knew he didn't need to worry about the rental car. He had sabotaged it before coming into the cabin. The woods were quiet, already gone back to sleep after the roaring gun battle had ended. Marco followed his uncle's blood trail, stepping around the large roots and broken limbs that littered the path in front of him. He spotted Lenny even sooner than he had imagined he would. "That leg must hurt like hell." "Huh, Uncle Lenny," called Marco. His uncle was sprawled with his back to an oak tree. The hood of his camouflage jacket had fallen over his head, and blood stained his pants. "I'm sorry it had to go this way. I thought about bringing you in on it, but I know you too well, Uncle. You would never have gone against Don Luigi." Marco stopped in front of his uncle, placing the barrel of his gun against the hood. "Remember what we talked about in the car? I wonder what kind of look a killer like you will get in his eyes at the end." He pushed back the hood and found himself staring into the dead eyes of Jimmy Calavari. A cold steel barrel suddenly pressed to the back of Marco Lucchesi's neck. "Misdirection, kid. You forgot the first lesson. Drop the gun." Marco dropped his weapon on the ground and raised his hands. "I saw you burn up in that car. You saw Tommy Abalone. We needed a body, and the Calavari weren't keen on splitting the money 5 ways anyway. If they had done their job and killed you at the hotel, none of this would have happened. They got too cocky, thought the car bomb would either kill you with shrapnel or at least leave you 2 days to fight. I could have told them you wouldn't die that easy. It was a good plan. You needed better partners. I'm glad you approve. I was always keen on making you proud." "Turn around, Marco." Lenny stood in front of his nephew, sighting down the barrel of his pistol that still had leaves clinging to the butt after he had fished it out of the underbrush. "So this is how it ends? I thought you valued family above everything else, Uncle Lenny? There is one thing I value more." "Yeah? What's that, Uncle?" "Loyalty, scumsucker," snapped Lenny, and he pulled the trigger. Grace came to slowly, rubbing at her jaw. Then she looked frantically around the cabin before spotting Lenny sitting on the floor with his back to the kitchen wall. "Now look who's sleeping late," croaked Lenny. "Marco?" she asked. Lenny shook his head. "I'm so sorry, Lenny." "So am I. We should get the hell out of here. That Tommy what's-his-nuts may still be around," said Grace. "He isn't. The Calavari used him to fake Marco's death. Still, we can't stay here." "You can't. Take the car and go. Find your way back to your father, Grace." I'm done." "I don't understand. What do you mean, done?" Marco was right about one thing. We can never leave this life, and I'm tired of making the hard decisions. I looked my nephew in the eyes today and took his life. That's one of 100 sins I can never atone for, and even if I wanted to, Don Luigi would never let me. So, yeah, I'm done. Lenny looked at the pistol that sat in his lap, running his hands across the metal. "No," said Grace. "Grace, don't make this harder for me than it already is." She reached over and put her hand on top of Lenny's, looking deep into his eyes. "I have a better idea, Lenny. Yeah, he said. Yeah, Lenny. It's called misdirection. I don't understand. It's time for me to call the shots, Lenny. Just do what I say. In the end, Grace had to do most of the work. Lenny's leg was too messed up for him to be of much help, so she had to lug the bodies back, placing them inside the cabin. The gasoline she got by siphoning it from the Calavari brothers' car. Do you want to do the honors? She asked Lenny. He took the book of matches from her, lighting the whole thing from a single match and tossing it through the front door of the cabin. The fire spread quickly through the structure. Rest in peace, Marco, whispered Lenny. You don't hold a grudge? I should have seen this coming. I'm paid to read people and know what they're thinking before they do. I missed what was going on with Marco. He deserved better from me. It's hard to see the danger when it comes from someone you love. I guess, said Lenny without conviction. Can you fix the car? I already did. Marco sabotaged it exactly as I taught him to. It was an easy fix. Then we should go before the park rangers show up. I know a discreet doctor in the city that can patch you up. Lenny stood a moment longer watching the old cabin burn. The flames were taking everything he had ever cared about with them, but he figured it was no less than he deserved. Don Luigi looked down at the papers littering his desk, rubbing his chin in thought. The latest peace proposal from Monzano wasn't a bad deal, and it would save bloodshed on both sides. In the end, avoiding war was in everyone's interest. Everything okay, Papa? Asked Grace as she walked into the room. Sure. I should be asking you that question? He said, eyeing the healing bruises on his daughter's face. These are nothing, she said, touching one discolored spot of skin. Some men made a greater sacrifice than suffering a few bruises. Yes, poor Lenny and Marco. They were good men. Carmine tells me that the cabin you two holed up in was burned to the ground. The corpses were so consumed there wasn't enough left to bury in a shoebox. A terrible way to die. It was the only way. He bought me time to escape. Must have been a hell of a fight, holding off all those gangsters. I mean, I know Lenny was lucky, but, as you say, he was a good man. I think he wanted to take as many of them with him as he could. To avenge Marco? I imagine so. Family is everything after all. It is indeed. I need to rest, Papa. Don't work yourself too hard, okay? She kissed him on the cheek and walked out of the study. Don Luigi watched his daughter walk away, then turned his attention back to the matters at hand. 6 months later, Steve Bridgman had been tending bar at the Red Orchid for 3 summers now. The tourist crowd was thick down in the Keys at this time of year, and a starving student could make some serious cash if he were willing to put up with a certain amount of crap from the often rude and impatient customers. There was one regular he didn't mind. A soft-spoken Italian man who came in late every afternoon and took a stool at the end of the bar. He never ordered alcohol, just water, or occasionally a soda. This fellow would sit and stare out the window at the ocean with a blissful expression, as if he had never seen anything like it in his whole life. Steve wondered at times what had brought him here, and what he did when he wasn't perched at the end of the bar. He had asked him once, but the man had only replied, "I'm retired." Since the guy looked far too young to be retired, he figured he must be some prominent entrepreneur who had sold his company for megabucks and now could lay back and enjoy the good life. Steve polished some glasses and mused for a bit about his customer, then smiled at the irony when he spotted the subject of his thoughts walking down the beach toward the tourist cabanas. The door to Cabana 1C opened, and Lenny Lucchesi stepped inside, shutting out the hot, muggy air of the beach with a flick of his wrist. 6 months on the sand had managed to tan even his pale skin, and he was starting to look a bit more like the woman who waited patiently for him in bed. "How was your flight?" he asked. "Bumpy," said Grace Riccoli. "I'm glad to see you've made yourself at home." She had left her clothing piled in a corner while she lounged in the middle of the bed. "Can I get you anything? A glass of wine? Some body oil? How about some music?" Lenny smiled and went over to clock radio where he had his MP3 player plugged in. He tapped a button on the side, and a second later the sounds of Bobby Darin crooning, "Beyond the Sea," filled the room. "Perfect," purred Grace. "Anything else?" "Only for you to get in this bed and make love to me." "Sounds good to me," laughed Lenny. They joined together, crashing into each other like the waves that were breaking on the beach outside their window. "I missed you," said Grace. "I am right here, baby, and I'm not going anywhere." Dear listeners, Please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.